Civilians try to flee but are forced to turn back as Russian missiles keep coming. An agreed ceasefire wasn't followed on a day when Russia continued its apparently indiscriminate bombing. And President Putin issues another stern warning to the West.
Now we are hearing that a no-fly zone must be established over the territory of Ukraine. But any move in this direction will be viewed by us as a participation in the armed conflict.
Also, America's Secretary of State visits refugees on Ukraine's border as numbers head towards 1.5 million. And Manchester City's Alexander Zinchenko holds back tears as he explains how his fellow Ukrainians are suffering.
When you're watching the people, how they fight for their lives, there is no words, you know.
This is ITV News with Chris Shipp.
Good evening. A temporary ceasefire in Ukraine's southern city of Mariupol to allow civilians to flee was broken today. In fact, it was never really allowed to begin, and those hoping to get out had to stay put. Ukraine still controls the port city despite intense attacks by Russian forces who have it surrounded. And there was another chilling warning from President Putin today as Ukraine appeals again for a no-fly zone. Any country that did so, Mr. Putin said, would be in military conflict with Russia. Our first report tonight comes from Romilly Weeks in Ukraine, which does contain some distressing images.
Within sight of this church outside Mariupol, the shells are still raining down. Even the religious will be asking, where is God here? The Russians say they aren't targeting civilians. This is 18-month-old Kryl. In what's left of a hospital in this besieged city. No one heard his parents' prayers today. Why? His mother's desperate cry. This on a day residents were promised humanitarian corridors to safety, but only the birds were allowed to flee, as Russia reneged on even that.
It is awful. We were eager to move people to their homes, to their flats, to safe places, because it's not possible to evacuate people under continuous shelling.
Most of those trying to escape the smoking ruins of Volnovakha were also turned back today, returning to a town that barely exists.
Humanitarian corridors must work today to save people, women, children, the elderly, to give food and medicine to those who remain.
As Ukraine's president pleaded again for NATO to introduce a no-fly zone, from the comfort of Moscow, President Putin threatened this. Any move in that direction will be seen by us as participation in the armed conflict. It will not matter what members they are. From the outskirts of Kyiv, many more are trying to flee, arriving exhausted in Lviv in the west.
Lviv is a city untouched so far by any shelling or bombardment, but touched by war in every other way. And this is what it looks like. Hundreds of people arriving here every single day, bringing with them their young children, their babies, their pets, trying to pack their lives into small suitcases.
In Kherson, the only city that Russia has taken so far, residents stage these courageous protests. Ukraine is taking comfort in these expressions of defiance. They need to when their reality is filled with scenes like this. Romilly Weeks, ITV News in Lviv.
A detailed look now at the latest situation in Ukraine on the second weekend of the Russian invasion. The failed ceasefire in Mariupol leaves the situation there unchanged. The city is surrounded and under bombardment, but still under Ukraine's control. Elsewhere in the south, Russian troops have reached the Dnipro River and continue to attack Mykolaiv, where Ukrainian forces have repelled several assaults. And up towards the north, the Russians have opened a new corridor from the east towards the capital, Kyiv. Let's go to Kyiv then, and our Europe editor James Mates is there. James, 10 days now since President Putin launched this invasion? I'm interested in your take on what President Putin was saying today to the West in no uncertain terms.
Well, he was, but it's not a great surprise because, frankly, a lot of Western politicians have been saying exactly the same thing. It is pretty clear that if NATO aircraft were to get involved in the airspace over Ukraine and enforce a no-fly zone, which would presumably involve shooting down Russian aircraft, that would be seen as involvement in this conflict and an act of war. And before you know it, you would have a conflict between NATO and Russia. And I think that's why this is completely off the table. However much President Zelensky has been pleading for it, angrily saying last night, look, if you don't give us a no-fly zone, then all future deaths in this conflict can be put at NATO's door. Now, this is clearly an overstatement and possibly designed to help him, in fact, get more in terms of arms, anti-aircraft weapons, possibly even drones or actual fighter aircraft themselves.
OK, James, in Kyiv, thank you very much for that. Ukraine's President Zelensky has continued to communicate with the world from his bunker in Kyiv, managing to address protesters in Tbilisi in Georgia last night, and then today the US Congress, though not in the chamber, on a private video call. Our US correspondent Emma Murphy is in Washington. So, Emma, what was he able to say to America's politicians on that call?
Well, he was addressing 280 politicians from both sides of the political divide, and he was offered lots of warm words and lots of support, but I would suspect that that's just what he doesn't want to hear. As James was saying there, this big push from the Ukrainians is for the no-fly zone. He seemed to acknowledge today that there was no hope of that, so then said that what he wanted was planes. Give us some fighter aircrafts, we will put Ukrainian pilots in them, but we need something to defend ourselves if you don't, was pretty much the gist of what he was saying. Now, he spoke via a video link to politicians who were in their own homes. They were asked not to share any of the images themselves, but he did share what he was seeing. And I think what's really noticeable in this is that speaking to senators over the last few days, there is a feeling here that they do want to do more. They want to go further. They want to be told what they need to do. But they do feel that that no-fly zone is just not going to happen.
Yes, OK, Emma. In Washington, thank you. The number of refugees created by Russia's invasion has now reached 1.3 million, and it keeps rising. That continues to flee in large numbers into Poland, where we heard today some harrowing stories from mothers who've made the journey with their children. The US Secretary of State has also been there himself, and as Rebecca Barry reports from the Polish border, Antony Blinken said to some of them quite simply, "I'm sorry."
They arrive carrying heartache that'll take generations to unravel. And each day brings more.
Who wants to go to France?
800,000 people have now crossed into Poland from Ukraine. But what will one-year-old Anna's future look like now? Her mother, Nastya, told me she left her husband and father in Donetsk.
She don't understand now what's happened, and I hope her future will be better than us.
The numbers here have swelled in recent days. The Polish authorities are organised, but the smell from the toilets, the sound of babies crying, and the trauma etched on people's faces hints at the growing humanitarian crisis here.
We're sorry for everything that you're going through.
This afternoon, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken came here to see it for himself, still refusing Ukraine's request for a no-fly zone, but promising solidarity.
What Ukrainians are doing is inspiring the world. And the world is united in support of Ukraine and against Russia's aggression.
For this little girl, at least, there's some distraction from the reality around her.
small remnants of lives they left behind. Who knows when they'll get them back? Rebecca Barry, ITV News, Kurczowa, Poland.
All British nationals still in Russia have been urged to leave the country. The Foreign Office here changed its travel advice today and says Britain should get out by any remaining route. Meanwhile, the government is fast-tracking a change to the law to allow the UK to impose faster sanctions against Russian individuals with Kremlin connections. Here is political correspondent David Wood.
This is not just a message of solidarity from the UK to Ukraine.
Ukraine will do it for the world!
But a call for the world to do more to increase the pressure on Putin and his supporters. They want more economic sanctions, even if it means bills go up here.
I think we should cut off all the oil and gas. Personally, I'd be prepared to go without heating for a year.
What Vladimir Putin is doing is a violation of human rights.
We would like to see tough sanctions. I know that decisions have been made so far to bring some in, but it's not quick enough.
That is a message echoed at rallies across the country, like this one in Manchester. Another was held in Bath. In Westminster on Monday, MPs will be voting to speed up actions against Russian oligarchs. The delay to action here has been blamed on legal issues. So the plans allow ministers to act instantly against anyone already sanctioned by the US, EU or Canada for 56 days, whilst the legalities are sorted.
We will continue to look constructively with allies, cooperatively, about how we can actually do more to isolate the economic interests of that group of people around Putin.
Labour wants them targeted quickly.
We are demanding the strongest sanctions against Putin. We must tackle the oligarchs here and go after their money.
Brands are targeting Russian pockets too. Samsung and PayPal, the latest to pause business there. Ministers believe Russia's economy is hurting and promise more pain. But so far that isn't forcing Putin to retreat. David Wood, ITV News.
Finally, the world of sport continues to voice its disapproval for Russia's war against Ukraine. The son of a Russian oligarch has been sacked as a Formula One driver, and Manchester City's Alexander Zinchenko has spoken emotionally about his fears for his fellow Ukrainians. But amidst all the turmoil, some golden news for Ukraine at the Paralympics. Chris Scudder has this report.
A further show of support for Ukraine, a minute's applause at Leicester's Premier League match against Leeds. But these were pictures not broadcast in China, whose rights holders refused to show them, a move being interpreted as a sign of China's strong relationship with Russia. And while Manchester City prepare to play neighbours United tomorrow, emotions are still running high for City's Ukrainian star, Alexander Zinchenko.
When you're watching the people, how they fight for their lives, there is no words, you know. So I know the people, the mentality of my people from my country. They prefer to die, and they will die, but they're not gonna give.
Meanwhile, Russian Formula One driver Nikita Mazepin has had his contract with the Haas team terminated. Mazepin's father, Dmitry, is a Russian oligarch with links to Vladimir Putin and part owner of one of the team's major sponsors. But amid the sadness and desperation, a ray of light for Ukraine at the Paralympic Games in Beijing. The team who had overcome major adversity just to be there was celebrating 3 gold medals in biathlon. And from one of the victorious athletes, Vitaly Lukyanenko, whose family and friends remain at home in besieged Kharkiv, a gold medal dedicated to those who protect our cities. Chris Scudder, ITV News.
Before we go, for more analysis from the latest from Ukraine, listen to our ITV News podcast, What You Need to Know. Correspondent Robert Moore joins Tom Bradby in the latest episode, How Far Will Putin Go? Available wherever you get your podcasts. Updates continue meanwhile on our website at itv.com/news. I'm back tonight at the slightly earlier time of 9:40. Until then, from everyone here, good evening.